All right. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Amphitheater Hot Shop here at the Corning Museum of Glass. My name's Eric Goldschmidt, and I am going to present a flame working demo for you all. And we are, for those of you in our in-house audience here, we are live streaming this to our YouTube channel out on the internet. So welcome to everybody who's joining us virtually as well. So let's see, I'm going to use the flame working process, which is really using a focused flame to soften glass to do some shaping. Nowadays that heat comes from a torch. This one's running on propane and oxygen, so I'll be running some flames that are going to run anywhere from about maybe 1,500 Fahrenheit up pretty close to 3,000 Fahrenheit. And I'm going to make a piece just like what you see here, or at least make as much of it as I can get through in the next hour and a half. This is a lidded goblet, has what I refer to as a faux marble pattern to it. And there are a few different points I'll focus on through the course of the demo. The first one is really just creating the faux marble pattern, showing you the different steps as to how that works. Then we'll get into how I work with this black borosilicate tubing, which is actually a very finicky glass to work with. It can crack very easily with temperature change. It can get discolored and have the surface get sort of rough if you don't handle it just right with the right flame settings and sort of heat it properly. And I'll also go through some of the different goblet techniques that I'll be working with. And Helen Tegler is going to join me and help me narrate our way through this. So if you're in-house, if you have any questions for us, raise your hand. Helen will grab the question from you, and we'll do our best between the two of us to answer it. Any of you out there in the virtual world, feel free to type questions into the chat, and Amanda is going to help us feed the questions and get those settled. So let me dive in here. I'm going to start by setting up some of that faux marble patterning, and I'll do this sort of cooking show style. The full piece takes about 4 hours, so to squeeze it into an hour and a half, I've done a whole bunch of prep to sort of move things along, and we'll see how much of this we can get through. I'm warming up my glasses a little bit at the moment. If you warm them up, they don't fog up with the mask on, so that is pretty helpful. And just going to slide this hose a little deeper within my mask here as well, which is going to cause me to slur some words here, but stick with me. So, step one, all this stuff that I'm working with starts as machine-drawn tubing. So whether it's the white base that I use for the faux marble, or the black tubing that I'll be using for the different black sections. This all starts as tubing that is 4 feet long, a nice consistent diameter and wall thickness. And this glass, as I mentioned, it's very temperamental. It can shock due to temperature change very easily and crack. So I'm trying to warm into it slowly here. I've set a flame that is around 1,500 or so Fahrenheit, trying to ease heat into a room temperature piece of glass. If I go directly to my hottest flame with this tubing, it would explode. As you heat glass, it expands. As it cools, it contracts. So if you heat or cool a piece of glass too quickly or too unevenly, different areas expand and contract at such different rates, they pull apart and they crack. So trying to ease heat in, and now that I've warmed into this a bit here, I can crank up the heat. I've added a bunch of oxygen into the flame. So now we're up around the 4,000 Fahrenheit range, and just soaking some heat into the tube. I am going to need to blow in a little bit as I do this, or I may need to, so I'm going to go ahead and get my hose plugged in, and the other end of this is fed straight into my mouth as well, so I can blow and inflate the glass as necessary. Now, to create this faux marble pattern, I start, as you can see, with some white tubing. This is jade white tubing is what it's referred to as. And we're going to add some wraps of a few different colors. So this is a black colored glass here. I'll also add an opaque gray, a transparent gray, and another white that is more of an enamel white, a brighter sort of white. So we'll start wrapping some of this around here. And for this pattern, I really don't want it to be too neat. I want it to look fairly natural and organic. If I wanted it to be really neat, that's certainly possible, but that just isn't the look that we're after here. So just throwing a little wrap of our black glass. Make sure that's sticking. We'll go with the opaque gray next. So the black that I just used, for those of you who are really keeping track of products at home, that was jet black from North Star. This opaque gray is pewter from Roger Paramore's new color company. So feed this on here. And I can control the thickness of the wrap by either turning the tube slower or faster. Slower is going to make a thicker line, and faster is going to make it thinner. I can also adjust it by how far I pull the rod away from the tube. It'll get thinner the further I pull away. So just getting these all laid on here. This is the transparent gray. This is Chinese smoke gray, I think is what most distributors are referring to it as. So just sort of touch it on there, get it to stick. Get this all wrapped around here.
I love this continuous line that you're creating just by feeding more glass off the rod. That'd be really nice in the hot shop if you start to run low. You just keep pulling it from the iron, right?
Yeah. I think this glass is quite a bit stiffer than what you guys use at the furnace here. So it really does require that I continue to heat it to keep it moving for the wrap.
Yeah, it's always fun to see how the movement of the glass is slightly different. Pulling them on it forever.
A lot of folks don't realize it, but there are many different recipes for glass out there in the world. There's actually tens of thousands of different recipes for glass out there, and just like a recipe for a batch of cookies or a loaf of bread, when you start changing ingredients in a glass recipe, you get very different characteristics to the glass. And one big difference in the glass that I'm working here versus what we tend to use in our furnaces is this glass melts at a much higher temperature, and it tends to be a lot stiffer. And once you do soften it up, it stiffens back up a lot faster than what we tend to use in our furnaces here as well. So it's a bit of a different animal, but still the same sorts of rules apply. So the next step, now that I've got these wraps of color applied, is to really fuse them in with the rest of the tube here. That takes a little while, so I'm going to expedite things a little bit here. I've already prepped another tube that I've added the full patterning onto, and the pattern now needs to be manipulated. We're going to slide this into the oven. It may or may not survive, but I'm going to speed things up a little bit more here and move right into this patterned piece where I've already worked in the wrap, and we'll show you what I continue to do to really manipulate the pattern here. There are many steps to getting this pattern just the way I want it and getting it to really work with the shaping I have to do to turn it into a goblet. So again, just slowly warming into this tube. It's even more sensitive as you add other glasses to these already sensitive base glasses. So just sort of easing heat back in here. And I'll start to add the oxygen back in. And again, that flame temperature goes from about 1500 to right around 4000 at this point. So I'm going to warm this. I want to see the whole thing glowing orange so I know that it's safely warmed and the heat has really started to soak in. We really use the question from the web, if there's a risk of trapping air bubbles in between those wraps of color as I melt them in. There could be a risk, but honestly, I haven't run into it. It hasn't been an issue with all of the pieces that I've made with this pattern. For some reason, it does seem to work in, and I don't wind up with air bubbles trapped. So, fair observation, but thankfully it doesn't seem to happen. All right, so now I want to manipulate the pattern a little more. I've got a tungsten pick in my hand here. I'm softening the glass so that I can drag the pick through and do what's known as festooning. And I've got just a dish with some water here so I can quickly cool the tip of the tungsten. I'll go along this a few times in one direction, which is referred to as festooning. But then I also will switch directions and drag material the opposite direction, which then technically becomes feathering. So the tungsten can take the heat of the flame really well. And I try to sort of keep the flame just ahead of the tungsten, so I'm sort of constantly softening a path to pull this through. And I do tend to work pretty quickly through this by sort of keeping a good steady pace. I keep the whole piece warm. If I go too slowly, there's always a risk that one area of the tube cools down too much, then it gets splashed with a little heat, and it shocks and ends up cracking. So moving quickly with this is definitely helpful. So I've just flipped the tube, so now I'll be pulling the pattern in the opposite direction and feathering. So just sort of setting the heat up first.
This is such a seemingly simple made but very complicated looking pattern when it comes together. This is a really ancient technique, and I love that you've got that little bit of undulation to each one of those lines. I feel like that gives so much more depth than if it was a perfect straight line wrapped around the piece. You're going to get a different aesthetic, but this one leaves a little bit more to that happenstance in the way the colors can kind of mix a little better.
Yeah, I definitely wanted these to look as organic as possible, so it is not typically in my nature to be really imprecise with things. I tend to be a little more OCD as you sort of need to be with cup making, but this is one area where I had to sort of force myself to make sure to get an organic look for things.
Someone was wondering too, the reason why you have a point on one end and hollow on the other instead of having them match each other.
So somebody wondering why I have two different types of handles on the tube. You can see on one end I've got the clear tube attached on there, and the other end I just have the same tube that I just sort of pulled narrower. I tend, when we're not in a pandemic, I tend not to work with a hose, a blow hose like what's attached to my mask here. I prefer just to put the glass right in my mouth and inflate it that way. And so I would typically heat the glass and stretch it. So I get these narrow point sections, but to get my hose attached, the hose attaches really precisely to this size tubing. So rather than having these, the white tubing on both ends, we refer to those as points. I remove one of the points and just add on the blow tube. And they are different diameters, so yeah, they're gonna spin a little differently in one hand versus the other, but you just sort of get used to it over time. It's taken me a little bit just getting used to having a blow hose in general. It's not my favorite thing to have to wear the whole setup that I've got on here, but we're all doing what we have to do these days. So now that I've done the feathering of the pattern, I'm going to do what a lot of folks in the flameworking world would tend to refer to as a wigwag, which is sort of heating one section, turning one hand a little faster than the other, so it starts to twist a part of the pattern in one direction. So you can see the left end here, got that twisting. And I do the same on the other end, and I'll sort of go back and forth, twisting one section after another. And I'll twist the opposite direction in between. So we wind up with a very organic pattern after all this. Now there are folks out there in the glass world who do very precise pattern work with this sort of technique, but that's just not what I'm after for this piece. And those folks who do this very precisely are probably getting a good laugh as to how I'm going about this. But again, I sort of want it to be organic, so I'm not even remotely trying to be precise here. Just trying to really move material around. So as I did the first twist, I was turning my left hand a little faster than the right. Now I'm turning the right a little faster than the left, so twisting the opposite direction there. So I'll do one more switch back here. And again, for the purposes of the timing of this demo, this is even more of a sort of a quick and dirty process than I would typically do with this. I am sort of zipping through this as fast as possible. So now that I've sort of mixed up the pattern a little bit more, I will change the axis of the form. Now I'm not going to go ahead and do that with this, but I am going to give you a little more insight as to how I would go about that. So now that I've manipulated the pattern the way I want it, I'll sort of work this back into a ball.
Is there kind of an ideal thickness that you've found works for putting on the striations and accumulating? If it get too thin, does it start to buckle? And
yeah, if it does get too thin, it will buckle. So I try to heat it slowly. As I'm heating, I'm trying not to turn too fast, so it'll sort of pull itself together and get a bit thicker. And again, as I'm sort of blazing through this, things are definitely odd thicknesses in there. But from here, now that I've got this into a ball, I can remove this other handle here. We'll just melt this off of here. And I know there's a lot of folks at home who specialize in sort of wigwag patterns who are wondering what in the world kind of mess I'm making on the end of this thing. I don't want it to look like a precise pattern. So I haven't terminated this into a very clean sort of center of a pattern. So just sort of rounding this up a little bit more, making it more spherical.
This kind of reminds me of one of the other live streams that we did earlier in the year where we had two of our gaffers come together to show different marbling techniques and approaching their different philosophies on how they did the technique and the final effects that they would get from each one of those marbling. And of course, you can check that out on our YouTube channel, just like this particular session is also going up on our YouTube channel eventually. You can look up Tom Ryder and Carl Siglin, Marvelous Marbling, I believe was the title of the thing. But it's always really interesting to see how different artists approach a very similar technique, but kind of creating their own versions of each one of those.
So now I'm creating a hole in the side of the form, blowing a little bit, just heating one spot, blowing a little bit. And now I've blown a hole right through here. And the next step would be to attach another tube right on there. This becomes my handle. I remove this other one, and all of a sudden I've changed the axis on the pattern. So makes the pattern a little more elaborate. And once I've changed the axis, and I'm going to set this one in the oven and maybe I can work with it later. So once I change the axis, then I stretch the pattern out, turn it into more of a cylinder, and I take the cylinder and sleeve it into a clear tube. So it's got a clear cover over the top of it. If I don't do that, sometimes those colors get a little bit fuzzy because I've been stretching them and pushing and pulling them so much. So the layer of clear really protects the integrity of the surface pattern. So I wind up with something that's nice and glossy in the end. So that's how the pattern happens. Now I'm going to move into a little more assembly. Inside of my oven, I have a bunch of pieces prepared. I already have the beginnings of the cup prepared in here. So I've taken a small section of the marble pattern. I've already attached it to one piece of the black tubing. I'm about to connect the third piece of black tubing so I can then shape the cup. Now, as I work with the black tubing, it is really sensitive to thermal shock, so heating it or cooling it too quickly can be a problem. It also starts to sort of break down its composition if you don't work it just right. So there are many different ingredients in this glass. And as you heat certain ingredients, they may tend to volatilize and start changing. They have a chemical reaction at different temperatures. And with the black tubing, if you don't heat it just right, don't have the flame set just right, it does start to break down. The surface gets fuzzy. It gets sort of gray, almost whitish after a certain point. So to avoid that, I'm going to handle the black glass very precisely. I'll sort of warm a general area around the spot that I'm trying to focus in on, keeping that whole area warm. Then I'll focus more intense heat just in the spot that I need to work on. So by keeping the whole area around that spot warm, the different ingredients don't have the opportunity to move into other parts of the tube. Might sound sort of elaborate and crazy, but these are, in fact, the thoughts that have to go through my mind as I work with this. So, Amanda, I'm going to step around you here and get the different parts pulled out. So we are going to need this and this.
We wanted to see the markers you were using to sleeve with.
Somebody wanted to see the marvers
Yeah.
that I was using to sleeve with. Be right on top of the torch there. All right, just getting kiln dust off of the sections here. And now I want to get these attached, and I'll have to blow in a little bit as I make that attachment. And you'll notice I'm only going to really get the tip of this black tube molten, but notice how much of it I'm heating. You can see how much I'm heating by the glow. So I'm soaking heat pretty far up the tube, not getting it bright orange, just getting sort of a medium orange going. And the pattern section is a lot thicker than the black, and they have different viscosities, so got to be pretty sensitive with how I handle this stuff here. So focusing most of the flame on the pattern section because it's a lot thicker, it needs extra heat so that I can blow it out as uniformly as possible. Start inflating it here. And I want to get rid of this little dip where the two glasses are meeting. So just sort of getting this worked together into a clean cylinder. Then I'll really start shaping different parts of it to create a nice goblet form. Okay. Start to inflate the pattern section a little bit more. I want to stretch it out, get it closer to a similar thickness of the black. I'm talking wall thickness, not outer diameter.
I just want to pop in real quick and welcome everybody once again here to the Corning Museum of Glass. We've got Eric Goldschmidt doing one of our live streams here. So if you are in-house, feel free to raise your hand if you got any questions or curiosities. We'd love to chat with you. And welcome to everybody who's tuned in online. Lots of questions can be answered online as well. Just type it right into the box there, and Amanda can relay those to us. We've got a lot of these live streams have been happening over the past couple years, and we've got a couple upcoming. And Eric, if you've got things, feel free to interrupt me as I'm chatting too. But we do have a couple other live streams that are coming up here soon. We've got the stars, or a few stars from Blown Away, joining us on December 10th through the 12th. They're going to be doing a live stream from 10 to noon and doing some meet and greet here at the museum. So that would be a really great opportunity to meet a few of our stars from Blown Away, Netflix series. Andy now and Kat Burns will be here to chat with. We've got another featured artist coming up as well, part of this Bring the Heat series. On the 16th is Chris Giordano. We're really excited to have him here from 3:30 to 5. It's been kind of every other week between 3:30 and 5 o'clock. We've been doing one of these live streams. The best place to check out the listings is, of course, our website, cmog.org. You got a full listing of live streams and upcoming events and everything that's happening here at the museum, regardless of the time of year, can all be found right on our website before you come for visit.
Someone was wondering if black foil is hard to work with as soft glass in terms of temperature management.
So another question from the web, somebody wondering if this black borosilicate glass is as difficult to work as black furnace glass. Is black furnace glass that tough to work with?
Well, I would say it's super soft, so it can be a little bit tricky, especially if you start to mix it with other colors like you have here. So as you're making encolmo pieces like you're essentially doing, as you start to build different structures on black, it tends to heat up very quickly, so it can soften and buckle a lot faster than, say, a white bubble might do, hold its structure just a little bit different. Now, never working with this black glass as a flame worker, I couldn't answer the the comparison per se. I'm more of a furnace worker, of course, but I would imagine they have similar persnicketies to them.
Yeah, viscosity is definitely an issue with this, but black borosilicate is actually very stiff.
Oh,
So
interesting.
I've got sort of the opposite thing going on here. The white that is the base for the faux marble gets very soft and stays soft, whereas the black is very stiff. It softens up for a brief period, and then it stiffens very quickly after that.
Interesting. Complete opposite. Now, there are different formulas of even black glass within different types of glass will act differently. So they do develop a stiff black for glass blowing. So you can pull very thin threads. It's called duro. And so when you pull those into very small patterns, it will continue to go smaller and smaller and smaller and keep that really striking color, where if you use the softer black I was referring to and tried to pull the same kind of lines and deal with the same diameters, you would end up having it just kind of spread and soften and really become more of a wiggly line. So I imagine there's very similar situations in flame working where they also have stiffer blacks and softer blacks.
Yeah, there are many different versions of black glass and borosilicate too. They're not all as tricky as this stuff here, but this happens to come in very nice tubing form, which is key for me for making a piece like this.
Yeah, in some ways you've already got part of the complication by starting out with tubing rather than having to start solid and blow a bubble and stretch that bubble into shape like we would in the hot shop. So having that starter point of already having very even wall thicknesses and building from there, I imagine could be a bit of an advantage in the techniques as well. Well, we've got a lot of, again, upcoming things, and since I know there's probably a lot of flame workers tuning in today, we want to introduce a little bit of a collab that we've got coming up in January, the beginning of January 10th through the 13th. Very honored and excited to have Dan Coyle, Hoobs, and Rhino joining us for a live stream. And I've been following a little bit of what they've been doing online, but I'm sure you could speak much more to that effect. But it's a very exciting collaboration, getting to see the inside view of processes that usually happen in smaller studios. You don't really get a lot of demonstrations in flame working that's not small and intimate settings, I think. So it's really exciting to not only have our live streams here with you, Eric, but also to be inviting some of the community to come in and really show off the amazing techniques that have been developed in the
these guys
community.
they're really pushing the envelope on
game changers.
What is done on a torch. So I'm so excited to get them in here and see what they pull off. I know they're already designing and planning, and they've got 4 days in the amphitheater here to work on it. So that should be
so much
quite
fun.
interesting.
But again, if you're curious about all of the things, so much stuff going on here at the museum. I feel like every week we come up with some new thing, new programming, new demonstration, new artists to come visit. And so keep an eye on our social media for sure, and the website for all those exciting opportunities.
All right, so I've got most of the cup form shaped. I'm trying to finish off the very bottom of it at this point, and then I can open up the top. So part of finishing the bottom involves creating a connection point where I can connect the cup to the stem. So I'm just focusing the flame on material that I want thicker, that will be that connection material. And as you heat glass, the atoms want to pull closer together. So as I just focus the flame in the same spot here, as long as I don't pull my hands apart, the glass just continues to pull itself together and get thicker. So now I've created a good bit of thick material for connecting. It's very difficult to add material in that spot on the bottom of a thin cup if you don't get it at this stage of the process. Trying to work off of a very thin hollow and add a thick, massive material can be really difficult. So I find it really helpful to just sort of shape that material right off the tube that the cup is made from. So just sort of rounding up the bottom. All right, and now I do need some sort of a handle on the bottom so that I can open this up. And I don't need to blow in anymore, so we're going to get the hose out of the way. Get this rod attached. And my hands are sweating a little bit. Just want to clean off the end of the rod here. The end of the rod is broken, and as you melt a broken edge of glass, it tends to boil and bubble. So just removing that material so we don't add any bubbles to the situation here. We want to make sure that handle, what we would typically refer to as a punty, is neatly centered. So everything will turn accurately as I go to open this. And the next step to open this up, I'm actually going to break the glass open. But I want to control how it breaks, of course. So to control it, I'm going to create a constriction where I want this to break, what we would refer to as a neckline or a jack line. And actually, just to be extra cautious, I haven't heated the top of the form in a little while. So we'll go ahead, throw a little bit of this cooler flame on there, ease heat back in. Then we'll switch to the more intense heat.
I think that's kind of a common misconception that people think of borosilicate glass, or Pyrex as a brand name, as being this indestructible glass that doesn't expand and contract. You can cook in it, you can throw a Bunsen burner on it, but it really does have this, not as striking as fragilities, I think, as soft glass, but there's definitely a lot of consideration that still needs to be taken on how that glass is heated, cooled, and even the connections in the way that you connect them is so much different than hot glass as well, keeping in consideration the melting temperatures and the way that things come together. That I found that very challenging, trying to shift from soft glass to boro, and just learning you can't get away with some of the stuff that you think you can, and you definitely have issues with connecting things. Have to be so much different in temperatures than what you would in soft glass.
Yeah, borosilicate is definitely not indestructible. And as you start adding other ingredients to it, like different colorants, it changes the equation even more. So yeah, you do need to sort of be smart and consider each color differently. Each shape should be considered differently. A lot of variables. All right, so I've created this constriction. I'm adding some stress to the constriction. I'm cooling it with the metal blades of my diamond shears. That's what we call this tool here. And I've cooled it enough that it sets up some thermal stress, and a little vibration is enough to get that to break apart there. So I want to open this. And as sometimes happens with this black glass, it didn't break completely cleanly, so we're going to give it a quick trim here. And try to straighten that edge. And I also need to consider how I'm heating the tube as I'm opening the lip for this too. As I mentioned, as I was starting to shape the bottom of the cup, I've got to sort of heat this whole top section, even though I really just want to affect the shape on like that last half inch or so. So I want to keep the whole thing warm so ingredients won't get pushed one direction or another and we don't break down the composition of the glass. But I focus the most intense heat where I'm really doing my shaping.
Someone's wondering what's the best jack to use for goblet making?
What are the best jacks to use for goblet making? It's really a feel sort of thing. But for me, one of the biggest concerns when picking jacks to use for flame working, you got to think about the temperatures you're working at and the fact that this flame is going to burn the wax off of the jacks very quickly. So you want jacks that have wide enough blades that they're not going to heat up too quickly and you're not going to lose all that wax too quickly. These here are just a pair of Jim Moore standard jacks. My own personal tool stash, I have a pair of Carlo Dana standard jacks. So they do the trick. For working borosilicate on the torch, you do not want to use cup jacks. They're so thin that they just don't hold wax for long enough. So just sort of tightening up the form a little bit here. Alrighty, so there we have our cup. I'm going to keep this warm in my oven while I work on the stem. So keep that in there. And I've already made sort of the middle part of the stem. And what I've done here is I just take some of the faux marble pattern tubing and I melt it enough that the air gets sort of squeezed right out of it. So that's actually a solid mass of that patterned material. Alrighty, so now I've got a section prepared for what's known as a trumpet foot, which is the foot that I've got on this other goblet here. So the trumpet foot is a nice, elegant look. It's also nice and quick for demonstration purposes. So again, just warming in to the tube gradually.
Someone asked what temperature your annealer is set at.
What temperature is my annealer set at? It is at 1070 Fahrenheit. 1070. Okay. So we'll start to shape this. Now my left side of the form here is going to be the top of the stem, or the top of the trumpet foot. So I want to narrow this down a little bit, start to set up some of the taper, and then the right side will be what gets flared open for the foot.
Do glassmakers ever get into blacksmithing to make their own tools? Well, I would have to say in personal experience, yes. I attended Southern Illinois University. They also have one of the only blacksmithing programs in the country, and so I was able to take a few classes, and I did make myself a couple tools. But it's not uncommon, if it's not necessarily blacksmithing, but it is pretty common for glassmakers to create tools for very specific purposes, especially if you're doing sculptural work or very specific flame working. There's very limited tool makers out there that make tools for the glassmaking community, and those are work of arts in their own right. They each have their own unique kind of designs and approaches. But if you can't afford it or you can't find it, yeah, make your own for sure, out of metal, out of different materials. I've made plaster things that you press into glass just to get texture. So there's lots of ways of making the things happen that you want to make happen. It's just getting access to the materials to do so. But often, yes, artists do need to branch out, and the more you're able to branch out and make stands and make equipment and work with those different materials, chances are the nicer your work will be, the greater expanse you can get into, the more technical details you can get into. And if you don't know how to make it, maybe one of your co-workers, co-friends, fellow glassmakers also get into it and be able to make what you need.
Yeah, and makers are going to make.
Makers are going to make.
And creatives are going to create, so.
That's right. It's actually one of my favorite things to look in everyone's toolboxes, because there's usually all the standards, and then the longer they've been in it, there's all these weird, unusual tools. And so you start to have to guess, what is that tool for? What did they use it for? Maybe they only used it for one particular project. But then you've got this tool that could be used for anything. So here at the museum, we have quite a few little remnants from the Steuben factory, some of the little tools that they use for very specific things. And it's always fun to kind of look through that pile and think, well, they might have used this to pinch a particular nose shape, but I want to use this to pinch a fin shape or something. And you can really start to play with all surfaces, all angles, to see what you could do with that material. Do you have a favorite tool that you've made for a specific purpose, Eric?
You know, my favorite tools are heat and gravity.
Heat and gravity, yeah.
Yeah.
Cost you nothing, take it everywhere.
Of course, I do have a very expensive tool bag with all sorts of crazy stuff in it. Also, I think a lot of makers tend to get obsessed over tools too. And,
yeah.
And I know you've been over to Murano yourself, and how many tools did you wind up picking up over there?
You know, I didn't pick up as many as I would have liked to, but I did end up, with a pair of jacks and a pair of tweezers.
Yeah, I went over to Murano in 2018. I've been very fortunate. It was actually my third trip over there. I told myself, you're not buying any tools this time. And
so you see all the toys.
Sure enough, I go over to visit Roberto Donà, who's one of the best tool makers in our business in the world, and chat with him for like 5 minutes just to say hi, and end up walking out of there with 3 new tools. It's just
that's the way it goes.
Just the way it goes, yeah.
Yeah,
Like,
I like
these
hardware.
These will fit my luggage. I guess these are going.
Yeah, exactly. Hardware stores, restaurants, butter knives. Man, you can do a lot with a butter knife.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it doesn't have to be expensive, fancy tools. That's the thing. It's just the most creative use of that tool. But yeah, I'm sure you're not the only one to walk into that little workshop there in Italy, and you just want to buy everything. They're so beautiful, just
Yeah.
as the tools themselves. They're so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and it's looking at a whole bunch of tools, it just gets your brain going. Like, oh, what would I make with that? What would I make with that? It's, I don't know, if you're a creative person, those creative juices are always on, so it's hard to not collect tools and dream about what you could do with them. All right, so I've got my trumpet foot pretty well shaped up here. Finished the top of the form. I've also created a connection point on the top of this form, which is my left side there, that will allow me to connect this to that other stem section that I showed you that's in the oven, the other, what we would refer to as a knop, that other bit of faux marble material. So now I want to open up the foot, and just as I did for the cup, I'm going to set a constriction where I want this to break, and then I'll use my diamond shears to really set some thermal stress, and we'll break this thing open. I'll flare it open. We might even have time to make the lid for this, so we will see. All right, so setting that constriction, and as I make the constriction, it's crucial that it's round and centered with the rest of the form. With both the cup and the foot, if that isn't round and centered, I'm not going to get a round, centered, level form from it. So every step of the way, I might be zipping through this pretty quickly, but I'm still trying to be fairly precise.
I like that you've set up a few tools to help you keep those things precision as well. Instead of holding, I mean, you have an amazing steady turn with your fingers, but even using those diamond shears as sort of a yoke to let it roll as you're working. You've got a small yoke that you use to set the other end of the handles on and things. And those kind of precision, that must help a lot with getting nice even shapes.
It definitely does, and I've hit the age where paying attention to working smarter and not harder.
Yeah, yeah.
Always sort of thinking about how to take the strain off of my body. I've been certainly dealing with some carpal tunnel issues over the last few years, and
And you've scaled up
got a lot
quite
more glass
large
that I
on
wanna
some
make.
of the work you've been making this past year and two as well.
What's that?
You've been scaling up quite big on some of the projects that you've been working on.
Yeah, sometimes my eyes get bigger than my stomach.
Well, you know,
But-
speaking of other fun things that you've been working on here, we've got this wonderful exhibition going on right now called In Sparkling Company. And our team had a pretty big impact on that, especially our flame working team, making a lot of components and parts for that exhibition as well. Now that's only up until January 3rd. It's had a really good run, and it's definitely worth checking out. You can read, of course, some details about it online, but it's nothing replaces seeing it in person. And so you definitely want to make a trip before January 3rd here to the museum to check that out and see all the amazing things from our collection and borrowed pieces, of course, but then the complete collection of items made right here in-house by our flameworking team.
Yeah, that was a really fun project to work on. I learned a lot about surface and texture
Yeah.
working on all those glass foods. And I learned a lot about 18th century British foods. Who knew?
That's one of the fun things here at the museum. We do as much as we can to bring the collection to life during our demonstrations. So there's lots of opportunity to delve into realms that you probably wouldn't as an individual artist. You might not be aware of certain time frames that pique your interest only because of the exhibition that's coming up and different things that they display here at the museum. So what a wonderful resource for us to have not only the collections, but the libraries, and then, of course, all these special events that pop up, and visiting artists is just one of the best places in the world to learn
Would you
what you
mind
need.
holding
Me to
that?
hold that?
Yeah. A little lower so I can take a quick measure off of this.
Oh, there you go. Me lounging on the marver here.
Perfect, thank you.
You're welcome.
Alrighty, so just getting calipers set so we can make a lid for this thing. So I did prepare some tubing for the lid. I think we've got just enough time for this.
I've also had a lot of really wonderful classes that have popped up over the past year, and some of them have been virtual classes. So if you haven't been able to come to the museum to actually study in person, that might be something to look into. Our fall and winter, of course, is well underway, but there's always lots of programming, and it will be coming back up in the spring and the remaining of the winter. So there's online classes, there's in-person classes. It's just a lot of opportunities to learn. And of course, this YouTube series that we put together not only are Bring the Heat, but you've also been doing a lot with this Connected by Glass conversation. Eric, I know you've been involved in a few of those. But we've been creating a massive amount of online content for people to reference, and especially in the past year, having challenges of being able to go places, take classes, it's great to still be part of that educational loop and offer what we can online to anyone who has the interest.
All right, so just getting things set up here so I can try to make a quick lid. And I want to make the lid before I assemble this piece so I can still get access to the cup to get it to size up properly. And Helen, I might call you into action actually a little bit more here.
Of course, whatever I can do.
Once I start to really get this shaped, I'll have you grab the cup and just hold it for me so I can make sure I really have this sized properly. I like my lids to fit as best possible.
It's always nice.
Yeah.
It's hard, though. It's hard to get things to match like that.
So typically, I would make the cup one day and then make the lid the next day, but we can't do that with a live stream, so we're going to try to get it all done now.
Yeah, there's often weeks of preparation that go into these live streams. There's a lot of things that you don't really see behind the line, but it's usually full speed ahead during the demos themselves.
Yep.
And so some things go to plan, some things don't, but it's always fun to get a chance to shine just a little bit.
All right. So when I set the calipers, I set them a little bit narrower than the actual diameter on the lip of the cup. So I blow the form to fit the calipers first, and then I adjust it a little bit, sort of widen out and create a flange. And it's the flange that will truly set right on the lip of the cup. So that's what I'm creating here. You can see I've got that one section that sort of popped out a little bit. And I'm going to heat that a little bit more, squeeze my hands together a little bit to create a little more of that flange form.
So is that flange then slightly hollow or solid?
It's hollow.
Hollow.
Yeah,
Okay.
I don't actually fold it back onto itself.
Okay.
Yeah, what I've found, if I do fold it back onto itself, it gets very sensitive to stress, and oftentimes they'll crack. Okay, so that is set up. So I want to finish the shaping on what ultimately will be the top of the lid. I'm not going to use all this material. I'm going to actually trim it down a little bit. So just trying to narrow it down. So I prepped this material not knowing exactly how big the cup would be. So I made sure to prep more material than I could possibly need. So now I'm at the point of figuring out what to eliminate. And I do shoot for a pretty consistent lid form. You can see how the lid on the cup that I made previous sort of tapers in a little bit. We've got a series of vessels in our modern gallery that were designed by Joseph Hoffman, who was a very important architect and designer around Vienna around the turn of the 19th to 20th centuries. And we've got this set of blue vessels that he designed, and one of those vessels is a candy dish that has a lid with a very similar sort of taper to it. And I really obsessed over that thing for a while, and then figured out how to actually make that form on the torch. So that has become a little bit of a signature thing for me with my lids.
I think that is probably one of the most common favorite pieces. Talking to a lot of glassmakers, they all gravitate towards that at some point in their career. There's just such a lovely and beautiful set.
It really is. Hoffman definitely had an incredible eye for forms.
Yeah. And you can look that up on our website. You can source a lot of things from our collections. Just look it up by the artist, and you can hopefully find a picture and maybe a little bit more information about particular pieces as well.
That's one of the awesome things about working here too. Just having
go and
access
stare
to
at
these
it.
collections. There's so much inspiration around here.
Yeah. It's always nice to get really close to something and see. There's so many subtle details in glass that you just don't necessarily capture in photographs.
Yep.
And so being able to get close and study these objects is such a key component to education.
All right, so now I want to open the other side of this thing, and I do sort of a unique version of a flame cut. So I'm setting a really sharp, hot flame, and I'm going to focus the flame where I want to cut this thing open. So it'll heat a really precise line of material. As that material softens, I'm going to start to pull my hands apart, which is going to make that material a lot thinner. And when it gets thin enough, I'm going to fold it back over itself. So it's going to seal off the hollow form. And as I do that, the air inside will continue to expand. So it's going to build air pressure inside. And as the glass gets thin enough and that air pressure gets to be enough pressure, it is going to pop itself open. There we go. All right, so now I want to get this material so it'll really fit nice and snug on that cup. So I'm going to shape this up a little bit more here, and we'll pull the cup out. All right, so the flange is just right, but there's a lot of play sort of side to side. You can grab below me there. Great. So I want to flare the material that's below the flange and pull that out a little bit, just so it'll hold a little more snug inside of the cup. I'm also using centrifugal force a little bit. As I turn, the glass is sort of widening itself out, but we'll use the jacks to guide it a little bit more. And let's see how that does. All right, that feels good. Excellent. So we'll put this. Yeah, I will trade you. Thank you. So we'll put this guy back in here. Keep you warm. And we'll finish the lid. Here we go. So I do want to add a little finial to the lid, which I've already pre-made. So we'll just get this rod out of the way. I'll get that finial attached. The lid will be done. And then I'll assemble the 3 parts of our goblet and get that done. So as I make attachments like this, and the attachments I'll make to assemble the goblet, I try to heat as little material as I can get away with, just what's absolutely necessary to heat to make a good, clean, stable attachment. The more material I heat, the more material I need to control, and the longer a period of time that material is going to stay soft for. It would be more thermal mass. So if I can heat as little material as possible, it makes my life easier. Life is tough enough already. Think about ways to make it easier. Can you say that again? Do I recommend using parchofis when flaring out the cup or the foot? Yeah, I use graphite parchofis quite a bit. I didn't bring them in for this demo, and I'm getting away with it, but it is nice sometimes to have the graphites. As my steel jacks start to heat up, they don't hold the wax anymore. They start to stick, and just making sure this connection is nice and clean here. Yeah, so graphite parchofis with borosilicate are really handy. They're definitely a very helpful tool to have. And I do typically finish opening cups and opening feet with the graphites. All right, so there's our lid. Get this settled back into the oven here. The next step, we're going to get all the rest of this assembled here. So we are going to attach the foot and the knop first, and then I'll get the cup attached to the rest. So let's see where that foot is. Here we go.
I always find that to be one of those challenges, trying to figure out the sequence of how you're going to assemble things together so that you minimize the amount of punties. Now, you've got the little grabber thing. That makes it a little easier on that aspect, but always thinking through that, oh, well, if I make this part, can I put it away for safekeeping? Can I bring this back out at what time to put it onto the other thing? Sequential.
One of my favorite things about glass making is all the problem solving.
Yeah.
I do enjoy it. All right, so move that bit of material there. I think I actually have to flip around the knop. Or do I? Let's take a look at that. Just rounding that out a little bit more on the tip. All right, it is facing the right way, that's good. So we'll get this attached. I'm noticing a little bit of kiln dust on here. That's just a little Kevlar glove that works pretty well for getting the kiln dust off.
So being the final connections, this is where you really need to pay attention to the temperatures and the way that they're connected, the shapes, the fold over. I learned a lot about those cold seals, putting objects together and having too much of an angle that can also cause a potential weak spot in the glass. Mm-hmm. So he's paying a lot of attention to that, just that tiny little area. Alrighty. You want to make work that doesn't break later once it's sold. So learning how to do all those different structures and making sure you have really good connections is so important for successful work.
Alrighty, let's see what grabbers are going to work. Nope. Mm-hmm.
What would you say are like the 3 killer skills that any flame worker should know to have a better time progressing in whatever niche of the field they're working in?
Oh boy, that's a tough question to handle right at this moment. Let me field that in a couple of minutes. Three pillar skills to be able to really advance in flame working. That's a tricky one, but you certainly need to learn to turn accurately. So just get in the habit of turning whatever's in your hands and trying to turn it as steadily and accurately as you can. You really need to learn to see the glow of the glass in very detailed ways. So that's definitely another aspect. Really learn to tune in to subtle variations in that glow. What else? And learn to make some of the fundamental shapes in both solid and hollow. Those fundamental shapes would be sphere, cone, cylinder. So those are pretty good partial answers to that question.
I think we're in such a wonderful time now as well that there's so many resources for people to even reference. I remember when I first started blowing glass, you were lucky to maybe get a VHS tape of somebody that they only showed you half the process. You know, so just paying attention, I think, as an artist is really important. And so many online resources, so many community groups that you can get together with and ask questions. There's a few, social media groups that just random questions. You got a curiosity, there's somebody there that's willing to talk to you about it. So opening up yourself to the community, I think, is really important as a young artist.
I would definitely agree with that. Alrighty.
And don't just mimic, actually understand why.
Alrighty, so as I finish this, I am going to need to put it into the oven pretty quickly here. Don't want to leave it in the open air for long or it may crack. So really just trying to get this all nice and straight, sort of eyeing it from top to bottom and all the way around here. Looks pretty straight. The only way to really know for sure is to check it on level surface. Get a little touch up here.
Now there's an advantage for torch working. Holding onto the bottom of your goblet as you spin to make sure it's straight before you put it in the oven.
Alrighty. One last little bit of touch up here as I'm finishing this up and straightening it, sort of torquing on the connection material a little bit, and it's out of the flame, so the surface stiffens up a little bit and it wrinkles a little on the surface. So I'm just going around with the little torch here, smoothing in any wrinkles. I think we're looking good. So, get the claw holder off of here. Try to. Alrighty. And we'll load this into the annealer. Alrighty. There we go. Thank you. Thanks. So, there we go. There's our faux marble and Como goblet. We will take a picture of that and it'll go up on the internet with the rest of the video. This will be up on our YouTube channel probably in a week or so. Did we answer all the questions, Amanda? Yeah. All right. Excellent. Well, we're going to call it a day then. Thank you so much for tuning in. And we do have a whole bunch more live stream activity coming up over the next month or so. So keep an eye on the website and tune in. Thank you, everybody.